In the last section, we spoke about some performance concerns that we might have with MongoDB. One possible solution to this is going to be setting up something called a cache server. In this section, we're going to talk about what a caching layer is when we wrap a MongoDB instance with it, and then we'll start working on implementing that inside of our application. So let's first talk about what a caching layer is. We'll first do a quick review of how our application is set up right now. So this is our application as it currently stands. On the left-hand side, we've got our React application running in the browser. That communicates with Express, that communicates with Mongoose, and at some point in time, Mongoose is going to attempt to reach out to MongoDB, issue a query, get a response. Mongoose is going to take the response, give it to Express, and Express will send that back to the React application. So that's what's happening right now. And I think that's a pattern that we understand pretty well. So we're now going to look at a very similar diagram to this right here, but it's going to add in one additional piece. And this additional piece is the caching server. So we're going to see what effect this caching server has on our setup. Okay, so here we go. So still the same thing on the left-hand side, but now in between Mongoose and MongoDB, we have this extra thing here called a cache server. So here's what's going to happen with the cache server. Anytime Mongoose issues a query, it's going to first go over to this cache server. The cache server is going to check to see if that exact query has ever been issued before. If it hasn't, then the cache server will take the query, it's going to send it over to MongoDB, and Mongo is going to execute the query. We then take the result of that query. It then goes back to the cache server. The cache server is then going to store the result of that query on itself. It's going to say, okay, anytime I execute that query, I get this response. And so it's going to maintain a record between queries that are issued and responses that come back from those queries. The cache server will then take that response and send it back over to Mongoose. Mongoose will give that data to Express, and it eventually ends up inside of our application. Now, any time that same exact query is issued again, Mongoose is going to send the same query over to the cache server, but this time, if the cache server sees that query has already been issued once before, it's not going to send the query on to MongoDB. Instead, it's going to take the response to that query that it got the last time and immediately send it back over to Mongoose. So there's no indices here, no full table scan, nothing. We're doing a simple lookup to say, has this query been executed? Yes? Okay, take the result and send it back over immediately, and don't send anything to Mongo. So that's the overall idea. Now, to make sure that the theory behind this is like crystal clear, I want to walk through the same process one more time, but with a more detailed and in-depth diagram. And we're going to see some of this occur like in this diagram. All right, so this one right here. Okay, so this is a very similar diagram, but I've blown up three portions. On the left-hand side, we've got the Mongoose server, the cache server, and MongoDB. So on the cache server, we can imagine that there might be some like data store inside there. It might be a key value data store where all the keys are some type of query that has already been issued before, and the value might be the result of that query. So in this case, we're saying that maybe we are looking up a bunch of blog posts by their ID. So maybe the keys here are the IDs of the records that we've already looked up before. So let's now imagine that Mongoose issues a new query where it tries to find a blog post with an ID of 123. This query is going to flow into the cache server. The cache server is going to check to see if it has a result for any query that was looking for an ID of 123. And in this case, nope, definitely does not exist. So this query is taken and sent on to the MongoDB instance. MongoDB will execute this query, get some response, and send it back. So we can kind of imagine that maybe the result of that query is a blog post like this right here. Something that has a title of my and content of blog. So this result is sent back over to the cache server. The cache server then takes that result and immediately sends it back to Mongoose. So that immediately gets sent back over, so we get as fast a response as possible. Immediately, like right after that though, or like kind of at the same time, the cache server will also take the query that was issued, which was to look for a blog post with an ID of 123. It's going to add that onto its collection of queries that have been issued. And then it's going to take the result of that query and store it right up against that query. So now we can kind of imagine that at some point in the future, we issued this same query again. So we're still trying to look for a blog post with an ID of 123. That would come to this cache server. The cache server would look at all the keys that it has. It would say, oh, I've already found a blog post with an ID of 123. So it would not reach out to Mongo at all. And instead, it would just take the result of that query and send it directly back over to Mongoose. So notice that this is like kind of a key value pair lookup here. We're not doing any type of like complex query logic. We're not using any indices, nothing like that. It's as fast as possible. It's a simple key value lookup. That's what we're doing here. Okay, so that's an overview of how this cache server is going to work. So you probably have a couple of questions here. You might be thinking like, well, what, we're only going to store IDs or lookups that use an ID? Well, no, we're going to write some code that's really fancy and will cache any type of query that Mongoose tries to issue. The other thing that I want you to be aware of, and you might already be thinking about, is, well, are we going to always cache all this data like forever? How do we ever update any records? And my answer to that as well is, don't worry, we're going to figure out a solution for that as well. So we need to think about how we're going to eventually kind of like expire data that is stored on this cache server. Because we don't want to always be storing data in the cache and always reading from the cache. Remember, one thing that's really important here, and I'm going to repeat this many times, the cache server is not used for any write actions. This caching layer is only used for reading data. So if we ever write data, writing is going to always go over to the MongoDB instance. And we need to make sure that anytime we write some amount of data, we clear any data stored on the cache server that is related to the record that we just wrote or updated. So just some things to be aware of. And I really just meant, if that doesn't make any sense, that's totally fine. I just mentioned those things to let you know that yes, we're going to cover those topics. That's the only reason I mention it. Okay, so I think we've got a better idea of how this caching mechanism works. So let's take a pause right now. We're going to come back to the next video and we're going to start to implement this cache server. So I'll see you in just a minute.